All right, so last week we went over the first half of what's going to be on your tape, and that's the memorized part. And let me just review that really quickly. And so, you know, all of this can be found in your syllabus under tape one and also in your notes, like the limits of confidentiality are in your notes. And so, just to be really specific, because people ask about this stuff, what can you have with you for your first tape? And what you can have with you is what's in the syllabus. So you can have tape one checklist, my little outline there. But the only reason to have that with you is in case you forget something. I mean, you should know it, but you know, you might forget one part of it and glance at it, but you're not going to read from this, you know. This is just kind of a security blanket, in case your mind goes blank. What do I do next? Glance at it and then don't look at it again. It's just kind of like, so you don't have to retape, you know, just because you forgot what's next. But no, you cannot have the limits of confidentiality there. You do have to memorize them. You can't have them written down anywhere that you can read. Um, and but so uh there's some things on here that you're not going to talk about that you're just going to notice, so like body language, tone of voice, verbal tracking and speed. You're not going to talk about that stuff, but you're going to take note of it, you know um so what you're going to be doing is it starts with the skills list. You're going to start with introducing yourself, you know, and you're going to ask what the client would like to be called. So, what are you not going to ask? How you doing? Because obviously they're in therapy. So something isn't going well. So, you know, and remember, uh, the way I bring up the next part is I always repeat their name. I say, "Oh, nice to meet you," whatever they want to be called. And that helps me to remember their name. It also shows that I'm listening and I want to make sure I can pronounce it right. Um, and, you know, have a seat. And then I say, there's a few things I'd like to go over before we begin, and that's confidentiality and the limits of confidentiality. And that's how I introduce it, and then I go through confidentiality, the limits of confidentiality, and I say, "Oh, do you have any questions?" And remember, you're with a fellow student, so say, go easy on them, No, thanks, that's fine, you know. If you have any questions about them, you can ask me in class. Uh, so if you happen to miss one, you know, and you're the client and the person playing the counselor misses one, let them know and stop the tape and let them start over again, because you have to get them all for the first tape. So just retape it. And if you know your partner missed one, say, "Hey, I think you missed one." And just start over again. Help them out. Don't let them run through the whole tape and then figure out they missed one and have to do it again, you know. So, help each other out a little bit. This is your first tape. Um, let's see what else. Hmm.
But sometimes I use a different phrase, a different, doesn't matter. It doesn't have to be exact.
So some things have to be exact, other things don't.
Day, you know, just the same meaning, but not exact.
So, like I said, it depends. So you have to use certain words like subpoena. You have to use certain words like not just parent, parent or guardian. You have to, like, there are certain legal things that you have to say.
If you state that you are harmful to yourself, but if I say something like, if you say that you are harm to yourself, you know what I mean? Like, it's a little phrase, a little different, means the same thing. I know, I'm being very.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I'd have to see what you actually say to give you an answer to that. Because, like, I know certain things have to be included. And you might use a little phrase, but still include it.
Yes.
So I'd actually have to hear you do it. Yeah.
When I was asking about or saying stating the part about causing or the victim of abuse, I know you mentioned specifically elderly children and vulnerable populations. Do we say that specifically?
Yes.
Okay.
And let me tell you why. Um, because
What was the question?
so the question is like, if you're a victim of abuse and you're a child or part of a vulnerable population, the reason that's added, see, and there's like these legal nuances to everything. Like people could, like a woman can go to a woman's shelter and she may have experienced abuse, but technically there are laws that as long as she's in the women's shelter and she's safe, you don't have to report that abuse if she doesn't want to. I mean, it might be recommended, you know, but legally, you don't have to break that confidentiality if the woman doesn't want you to because she's safe. So there's lots of little nuances. But if it's a child or elderly, they're not in the same situation as like a woman in a woman's shelter. So there's like all these different nuances. So if I put something like that in there, it's a legal reason. Yeah. And I actually copied it from like an ethics book. So yeah. Yeah. So, but honestly, that's the only section that has to be pretty specific. You know what I mean? And that's because it's a legal thing, and I didn't make it up, and that's just the way it has to be. Um, so, and honestly, it's not that much to memorize. So, let's see. Uh, so once we move beyond the anxiety of limits of confidentiality, um, you know, talk a little bit about the counseling process. And this doesn't have to be exact. I gave you a whole little short paragraph about that. I talk a little bit about, yeah, you're probably going to experience a broad range of emotions. I just want you to feel safe, to work through them. And, that usually brings about some type of growth. And, the part that's up to you, if you've had the theories class, philosophy or theory, um, that's the part that is optional. If you've had the theories class, you need to include it. If you haven't had the theories class, you don't have to include it. But you wrote about it in your paper if you did have the theories class. And it's only a couple sentences, we're not going to talk 5 minutes about your theory, or your philosophy. I have about 3 or 4 sentences that takes under a minute. Once again, and then any questions so far? And then I usually ask have you ever been in counseling before? And once again, it doesn't matter what you say for this. If you've been in counseling and don't want to disclose it, say no. It doesn't matter. Um, you know, you don't have to disclose anything you don't want to disclose. Um, but it's more for the person playing the counselor to respond. That's the whole purpose of this. and every answer ends up being the same, you know. Yeah, but I hope you'll have a positive experience, you know, in counseling with me. So that's the memorized part. Okay. It's really not that long. Um, it might take 5 minutes, you know. So then you've got 20 to 25 minutes of the rest of the tape. All right. And what gets you to the next part is what brings you here today. And that's when they share what brought them to counseling. Um, so that's called an unstructured invitation. And before we start this second half, I just want to make sure there's no more questions about the first half.
If we haven't had the class, but we kind of have an
Yeah,
idea.
if you want to give it a shot, go ahead.
Okay, cool.
What else? All right. Next part. Just change the view here. Okay. So now we're moving into the second part. And if you've had, it doesn't matter whether you've had theories or not, theories class or not, because I'm going to go over each one of the skills with you. Okay. And so it's all person-centered theory. And the reason it's person-centered is because you might be a person-centered theorist, and that's great. And this might be all you use for counseling. But even if you're like really into CBT or REBT, most therapists still begin the session building trust with person-centered, and then they move into whatever other theory they like. It's almost like, starting off, uh, you know, Carl Rogers, who was the theorist with person-centered therapy, reminds me a lot of Fred Rogers, Mr. Rogers. And, I think that, they both used a lot of the same skills in each of their venues. And there's been a lot of comparisons. And, I think that I tried to do some research, and I used to sit across the aisle in church from Fred Rogers, and but I didn't really want to bother him much, like said hi and everything, but went to coffee hour or whatever, but I never really wanted to bother him because that was kind of his spiritual time. So I always wanted to ask him if he like studied like Carl Rogers or person-centered, and I've never really been able to find the answer to that. I've tried looking it up and everything, but you know. So usually when people say, begin therapy, they say, "What brings you here today?" And most people in therapy do not bring up their real issue. They bring up a presenting problem. And that is, I'd say 75% of the time at least, a symptom of a deeper issue. Okay. So, and like I said last week, one of the big mistakes that counselors make is that they begin to work on the symptom before they find out what the real issue is. And the clients love that because they want to talk about their current problem. But if they solve whatever the problem is, the symptom will go away, but it'll come back because you've never dealt with the deeper issue. So surface level symptoms that result in problems keep reoccurring unless the underlying issue is dealt with. And we're not going to do any kind of treatment in this class. Our sole purpose is to identify the issue using basic Rogerian skills. Other classes should teach you how to treat the issues. As people present a problem, as you try to find a deeper issue, I would say the philosophy of this class is that if you can find a deeper emotion, that deeper emotion is going to be connected to a deeper issue. Okay. So let me give you an example of that. So somebody says, oh, I was so angry, today. And they tell you they're angry at somebody or a situation or something like that. Anger is a secondary emotion. It's a surface level emotion. And so it's connected to a symptom. And I'm guessing that this anger reappears in all kinds of different situations. And rather than dealing with this situation, and I'm guessing ultimately the goal of the client is not to experience so much anger anymore, not to have that come to the surface as much. And so, I start talking about the feeling of anger. And there's lots of ways to do this. I could be I could explain what a secondary emotion is and ask them, is there a deeper emotion you're experiencing with that anger? I might say something like, I might go about it a different way. I might say, is that anger the result of a deeper emotion? And see if they can follow that train of thought. You have to kind of try it at all different angles. Now, what a client is going to do first is they're going to give you another secondary emotion. I was really mad. And they think, oh, okay, that'll let me off the hook. Why would they do that? Why would, if they say I'm angry and you ask them for a deeper emotion, why would they say, well, I was mad? Why? Why wouldn't they want to go deeper? Yeah. So going to a deeper emotion creates anxiety. There's a reason they're in counseling. And it's because they don't want to deal with those deeper emotions because they create anxiety. Yeah. So then if I notice some resistance, if they're giving me a bunch of secondary emotions and not going deeper, I might say, well, I notice you're giving me a bunch of surface level emotions, but we often feel anxious or uncomfortable when we go to a deeper level of emotions. And that's perfectly normal to feel that way. So I talk about the resistance. I point out what is occurring in the session. And I normalize that they're going to feel a little uncomfortable going to a deeper emotion. And I give them permission to feel that way. Okay. And I say, well, even though you're feeling a little uncomfortable trying to look at deeper emotions, maybe you'd be okay to give it a try. And I don't ask them because they can say no. I usually say, maybe you'd feel okay about giving it a try. I say, I don't say, would you like to give it a try? No, I'm really not comfortable in doing that. Well, that's the end of the session then, unless we process the resistance, which can still get you to a deeper level of emotion. So I don't move on to any other topic, to anything else until I get to a deeper emotion. Why bother? Because then we're just dealing with surface level stuff. And so as we begin to talk about and process this anger, eventually we might find that it's the result of, oh, well, I feel like I'm not valued at work. I feel like I'm being taken advantage of by others. I feel like I'm not being treated like a human being as an equal. I feel like there's bias. I feel like, there's 1,000 different things they might be feeling that results in anger. Okay. I feel betrayed. Maybe they're talking about a relationship. Maybe it's not work. Maybe it's a relationship. Okay. So, what I'd like you to remember is usually they don't bring up a deeper emotion. If they do bring up a deeper emotion, great. We'll go with that. But normally they don't. They bring up a surface level emotion. I want to find a deeper emotion. And eventually that will link to a deeper issue. Okay. So let me give you, it's good just to give examples, so you can kind of get an idea of where I'm coming from. Because I can't give you a list of every surface emotion, secondary emotion, and deeper emotion. But I can give you an idea of how to work with emotions. So let's say a student brings up, well, I'm in grad school, I'm taking clinical mental health counseling or school counseling, and I'm just, feeling really nervous about this class. It's this skills class, and there's this crazy professor named Grafton, and you know, he's not teaching this class like other professors. He's not giving us an exam. He's not, I could normally just study for an exam, take the test, and pass. But this is all like unknown. I don't know what the expectations are. And even though he says, what's the worst thing that can happen? I just do it again. I'm not sure whether I can trust that because, you know, this is all new. This is a stressful experience. So, what do you think some of the emotions are? What's the emotion that the client brought up?
Anxiety,
Did they say anxiety?
nervous.
Nervousness, and they didn't. What did they actually say? What are the emotions they actually verbalized? So nervousness and stress. Okay. They did display a little fear. Okay. So the first skill is reflection. Okay. And reflection is like looking into a mirror. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to reflect the feeling that the client expressed. And I'm usually going to use the same word that they used or multiple words. And then I'm going to follow it up with some phrase that takes them to a deeper level. Okay. And a reflection is usually brief. It's a couple words, and it's the shortest of the skills. So I'm going to repeat a few words. And I don't like therapists that are like parrots, you know? Like if I say, yeah, I'm feeling really stressed out about this class, I don't say stressed out, you know? That's like, thanks for the cracker, you know? So, you know, don't do that. Use complete sentences. Be empathic. You know, show you care. So you're feeling stressed out and nervous about this class. Let's focus on that. Let's go a little deeper with that. Sometimes I use the phrase, let's unpack that. So hopefully that'll begin a dialogue that moves to a deeper emotion that's connected to nervousness and stress. So I might say, tell me a little more about that. And they say, well, you know, yeah, you're right. I am feeling stressed and nervous, and I'm feeling nervous that I might not be good enough to pass this class. And I say, so you're saying you might not be good enough. Not good enough for what? To pass this class? Let's talk about that phrase, not good enough. And I'd go deeper with that because is it really not good enough to pass this class? I'm betting it's not just this class. I'm betting that they feel not good enough, fill in the blank with 1,000 different things in their life. So that's how we get this ball rolling. Okay. And if we follow this line, the deeper fear and feeling is, you know, so the deeper feeling is fear. Okay. And it's not just about this class. It's about, um, you know, if I don't pass this class, then what? You know, then I'm a failure. Okay. So if I'm not good enough, then I'm a failure. Well, what happens if I'm a failure? Well, then other people aren't going to accept me. So it's really, I'm not good enough to be accepted. And it might be as accepted as a therapist, accepted as a counselor, accepted as a good student. But I'm guessing ultimately, as we move through a half an hour, it might be I'm not good enough to be accepted for who I am without conditions. Yeah. So it doesn't matter if I fail this class. It doesn't matter if I fail this program. I, as a human being, am still deserving of acceptance unconditionally. But most people are brought up with conditions. From a very early age, they are taught without even words. Well, maybe one parent is into some kind of sports. Well, even though the parent might be a great parent, they might get more praise when they're doing well at that sport than when they're doing something else. And of course, children move towards the greatest praise because praise equals acceptance and love. It might not be a sport. It might be academics. It might be a profession or skill. It might be who knows what it is. It could be anything. Popularity, you know, certain interests. You know. So, I mean, I've noticed with my own kids, and I'm a therapist, that I tend to be more interested in things that they do that I'm also interested in, you know? even though I want to accept them totally unconditionally. It just so happens I'm interested in certain things, so I get excited about it. And I spend time because that's what I know about, you know? So it's not that anybody has a bad parent or caregiver. It's just human nature, you know? But we want love and attention from our parents or guardians, and that's what happens, you know? So, it's kind of like this unconscious thing that happens, you know? And in some cases, it's more pronounced than in other cases, you know? Sometimes parents put pressure on kids to succeed, or they're not happy with them when they're not succeeding at whatever it might be, you know? Um, and so as the years go by, eventually the teenager incorporates that into their view of self. And I might not accept myself unless I'm perfect, whatever that perfect means. So that's just anxiety, fear. So, but let's take this a step further since we're on the subject. A lot of times people incorporate this into acceptance of self, you know? So, um, so I did this myself. So I gave you the story about, my professor saying I needed to give up control. And so that's one thing you're going to have to be aware of. You know, I don't want you to rush through the memorized part like you're going through a checklist. It needs to be conversational, you know. As you're moving through a counseling session, don't say, I did the reflection, let's move on. Uh, so it's really about giving up control and seeing where the client needs to go and then responding appropriately using the skills. So let me give you an example of accepting self. Okay, so yeah, I came from a military family. Things were pretty regimented. Um, but I'm also kind of like Gen X, so there was like a lot of unsupervised time. So it's a weird mix. But but yeah, so one of the reasons people, including myself, needed control was so that if I'm in control, I can make sure that everything goes right, that everybody's happy, and that I can succeed and not be a failure. That way, everybody will accept me. So, control is a coping mechanism for anxiety and the fear of failure. So, the way I learned that I had incorporated partly perfectionism and control, but really only accepting myself conditionally. If I meet certain conditions, then I'm okay. Then I'm worthy. Worthy of what? Worthy of being loved and accepted by others and myself. So the way I learned this was that I had a long-term relationship, and I had never lived alone. I lived with my parents and lived in a dorm and lived with a partner. And but eventually, that relationship ended and I got an apartment by myself. And that was the first time I truly lived by myself. And after a while, I realized I didn't like living with me. And if I didn't like living with me, who else would? And so it was this weird twist that, control and perfectionism and everything else, but I didn't even like myself when I was that way. So it was a long road, not only to give up control, but to accept myself unconditionally and to believe that I too was worthy of that unconditional acceptance. It was very easy for me to accept other people, but it was hard for me to accept myself. Um, so it's not like I was judgmental of anybody else. It was like the opposite, you know. I would accept anybody for who they were, you know, no matter what. But I was harder on myself. I had this critical inner voice. I had like, I have to fill in the blank in order to be acceptable. So it was a long road, but it also changed my life, believing that, hey, I'm okay just the way I am. And yeah, everybody needs to change certain things. But my philosophy is that we're all born perfect, you know? And as we move through life, different things happen to us. We experience, you know, negative things. It's a tough world. People aren't always kind. People aren't always accepting. Um, you know, we experience all kinds of rejection and judgment and conditions. And that's all the baggage that we pick up throughout our lives. And we're carrying this weight with us. And eventually, you know, when we're adults normally and we're not happy, we might go to counseling. And that's why I use the word, let's unpack that. So I believe that counseling isn't changing who we are. Counseling is getting rid of all that baggage, all that negativity that we've picked up as we've gone through life and letting it go and being happy with who we were originally created to be. So it's a little different than I need to be a better person. Nah, you really don't. I need to change myself. Nope, you really don't. You need to let go of all the negativity that you experienced and realize that you deserve to be loved and accepted for who you truly are, and to figure out who you truly are without incorporating other people's expectations of you. Who are you really? So, yeah, that's kind of where we get with reflection. Um, so even though reflection and person-centered theory sounds pretty simplistic, it's really not. All right, so let's talk about the next skill. And the next skill is paraphrase. And paraphrase is kind of sounds like what it is. Like reflection is just a few feeling words. But as the client begins to talk more, they might talk maybe about a paragraph's length. And so paraphrasing is kind of a long reflection of that paragraph. Okay. So it's not just a few words. It's, you know, kind of rephrasing what they shared in a longer conversation. So Grafton, thank you so much for sharing that transformational period of your life. You for the first time, you were on your own and you were not in a relationship, and you realized that you weren't really self-accepting. You were placing all these conditions upon yourself. And so I would move in that direction. And um, and then I usually follow up with a question. I'm like, what were some of the things that you did to realize that you were truly worthy of being accepted for who you are? You know, so I'm continuing this dialogue and finding out more. But it's through that paraphrase and then me asking a deeper question. Okay, so that's paraphrase. All right, the next one is clarification. And clarification is basically, okay, well, Grafton, thanks for so much for sharing that. But I just wanted to, and sometimes I use the word, so I just want to clarify, or I usually say, I want to make sure I'm on the right track. I want to make sure I'm understanding, what you're sharing with me. So, you know, you tell me that, you had like two extremes to your life. Like one was really regimented with like severe expectations, being in kind of this military family. And then I point out an incongruency. But then on the other side, you're like Gen X and you're like this feral child and had all this free, unsupervised time. So you could leave it at that, or you could say, how do you compare and contrast those two areas of your life? So I use clarification. I want to make sure I'm on the right track. I want to make sure I'm understanding what you're sharing with me. And then I used pointing out an incongruency where there's like two different parts, that the client shared. And how would I compare and contrast them? Or how do they both fit with who you are, or what you're sharing with me? All right. The next thing is summarization. And summarization is the last thing you do in a session. And it is what it says it is. Well, I think we've had a really positive session. And then I kind of share what we've talked about. And we started off talking about, you know, uh, anxiety and stress and nervousness. But then I think we got to a really, really deep place when you're talking about like self-acceptance and acceptance for who you are. And you told me about this, life transition and you know and we've only got a couple of minutes left, uh so that's kind of my summary, you know and I might say, is there anything that you'd like to add, as we close this session? And that's how I end the session. So it's pretty straightforward. And I think the only couple things that I didn't bring up um, are domains and drawing out a narrative. So do not draw out a narrative in the very beginning. Stay with finding a deeper feeling. Use reflection, paraphrase. Once you get to a conversation where you're talking enough to paraphrase, then you've probably got to a deeper feeling. So I might say, wow, so, you were a little controlling, so because you were afraid of failing, can you give me an example of that? Can you tell me a story about that? So drawing out a narrative usually comes after a paraphrase when you've touched on a topic that you'd like to learn more about. And then I say, and it usually has to do with that deeper emotion. And then I say, can you give me an example of that? Can you tell me a story about that? And then they tell me a story. That's drawing out a narrative. And then I paraphrase the story and I end up asking a question about that. And hopefully I point out some deeper emotions that they expressed in that example. Yeah, did you have some? Okay. All right. And domains. Let's talk about domains. Okay. So there's 3 domains. You're going to deal with 2 of them. So the one domain is physical. We're not going to get into physical problems, you know. An example of that would be I had a client who was in an automobile accident, and there were a lot of emotional issues tied to that accident, and there were physical injuries that they had to deal with. That's an example of that. We're not going to do the physical domain. You're going to cover that in DSM. But we're going to deal with the other two. So the first one is career and academic. Okay, you might be in school, you might not have a job. Client might have a job, they might not be in school. You might have both. Okay, so let's just say, so I brought up, oh yeah, I'm in this class and I'm feeling anxious and nervous and stressed out. And, you know, so that's an academic example. And as we move deeper, as I get to that deeper feeling of fear of failure and a hope for acceptance, a fear of rejection, um, you know, I might talk about other classes or other degrees, or, I might try to draw that out in a narrative. Can you think of a time maybe in undergrad that you experienced something similar? Yeah, I had this one crazy professor in undergrad too, totally stressed me out. Um, you know, so, what you're beginning to do is draw out a theme when you do that. And you're showing the client that, yep, see, well, it's not just Grafton, it's not just this class. This is kind of a theme that happens in a lot of other classes. Once you play out this entire thing about academics, I wonder if you have a job. Are you working while you're in school? So, does this ever happen at work? Do you ever have these fears at work? How does that play out? And then you move to the second part of academic career domain. And I'm guessing it plays out at work too. So that's the first domain, academic career. And you explore both possibilities if the client is in school and has a job. If not, you just stick with one. All right, the second domain, so academic career, there's two parts to that domain. The second one is probably the one you're going to talk about with most clients. And that's because life is about relationships or the lack thereof. And so think about the various types of relationships. And there's three primary kinds of relationships. So there's significant others, so person you're dating or your partner. There's family, and there's your family of origin and or current family if you have one. So, and when you think about family of origin, there's the family of origin when you grew up, but if those people are still alive, what's your relationship with your family of origin now? So that dynamic might have changed or it might have continued. The other type of family is you may not have kids or you might have kids. You might have a family dynamic now of another generation. And then the last one is social, which is your friends and peers. And that could include, your friends, your work colleagues. That's the last one. So when you think about domains, they're going to bring up one domain. They're either going to bring up career academic or they're going to bring up social relationships. And don't jump to the other domain until you're thoroughly done with the domain they brought up. And that means so if they bring up school, you're going to play that out until you get to a deeper emotion and possibly the issue. And then you're going to go to career, if they have a job. See if there's a link between those two. See if there's a theme. And then you can move to relationships. And I usually, you know, so most therapists like to start with family of origin. You know, I start with current relationships or the lack thereof. And I move then to families. Because I want to see the primary dynamic that's occurring in your primary relationship right now. Or maybe you don't have one, and that's okay too. So, and then you explore the three parts to the relationship domain. So that's 5 parts of 2 domains, and we're not going to talk about physical, the third domain. So 5 parts to 2 domains should definitely eat up 25 minutes of a tape. That should not be a problem. You might only get to 1 domain, and that's okay. You do not have to hit all of the domains and the parts. 25 minutes to 30 minutes is good enough. All I want to see is demonstration of the skills and finding a deeper emotion. That's your goal. Okay. You can all do the memorized part. I have confidence in that. But the skills part, remember, I'm like, you're either going to feel nervous or comfortable with the memorized part, and you're going to feel the opposite about the skills. And that just depends on, what you feel more comfortable with. But the most important part of this is not the memorized part. It's the skills. So let's we're going to take a break. We're going to practice these skills. And so questions about the skills. It's a lot, I know.
I guess I have like one major question with the domains. So like are you hoping in like an ideal world, are you hoping that we hit both of those domains in our tape? And if so, how does, and I guess I'm kind of answering my question as I go, but like in our tape, how would that natural progression go? And I'm sure it's, dependent on the person, but between that career/academic domain and then into the family portion. Like I can understand some aspects of it, but I feel like there's other aspects where making that connection would be difficult or making that transition would be difficult.
So no, you don't have to go to all the different domains. Try to do just one domain at least. So, I'd like you to, if they start with career or academic, I'd like you to do career and academic. If
Gotcha.
they start with a relationship, try to explore the 3 different types of relationships. How do you move from one part to the other? Well, Grafton, you've really shared a lot about, academics and how you feared failure. So you brought in all this control and, you were even having trouble accepting yourself. And I think we had a really good conversation about academics and school and how you've dealt with that. I wonder, I wonder how this all plays into your career and job. Let's talk a little bit about that.
That
So,
makes sense.
yeah, it's not like there's no secret way to do it. It's just, let's talk about that.
Gotcha.
Yeah. What else? All right, we're going to take, well, yeah, 10-minute break. So come back at like 17 after, and we're going to find partners, and this is going to be the partner for your tape as well. Okay. And then we're going to practice. All right. All right.
biosocial assessment fit into
Okay, so I have everybody face to face is paired up. So now I want to do online. Is there anybody who knows it, what partner you want? Does anybody already have a preference?
I think
I
we're
do.
Right,
Sorry.
type it in the chat
Mhm.
and I'll copy it down.
Okay.
Okay, we got Rebecca and Emily. Okay, and we got Brandy and Matt. Is that correct? Matt, is that correct? Okay. Okay, and we got Jamie and Ellie. Okay, and let's see. Dun, dun, who don't we have? We got Layla, and how about Isaac? Do you have a partner? Okay, yeah, I'm just going in order on the screen. Layla, is that okay? You and Isaac?
Yes, that should be fine if that also works for him.
Okay. All right. We have MH Scott and who else? Who am I missing? Who else doesn't have a partner? Somebody doesn't. H and we've got Becca, Ellie, Brandy, Matt. All right, Jessica, do you have a partner? Okay, that's what I was asking. Okay, so MH Scott and Jessica. Okay. All right. So, what I'd like you to do, since it is 8:20, each of you, I'm going to pair everybody up into you and your partner in a room, online room, and here we have four corners. So that's as far apart as you can get. Okay. So everybody's going to be paired up with their partner. It's going to take me a while to get around to everybody's room, but I'm going to visit everybody's room once or twice. Okay. To see how it's going and to see if you have any questions. But move through the memorized part. But you really need to practice, because I know you can memorize it. I know that. You really need to start practicing the skills. Okay. And get your partner's information, like their email or text or whatever you feel like sharing. And you might want to practice together sometime this next week before you tape, and just so you're kind of used to each other a little bit. I mean, I know you don't have that luxury with a real client. You've never met them, you don't get to practice. But in this class, you get to practice with each other. And, that's an added bonus. And then, so we're all going to come to class next week. And because I want you to have enough time to practice tonight, don't worry about how you're going to record. I'm going to spend the first 30 minutes of the class next week telling you how you're going to record and upload this. So don't worry about it. I'll go over it. Okay. And If there's a technical problem, it doesn't matter. We've got 3 or 4 weeks to share our tapes. It'll be okay. Don't freak out. If your computer crashes and you couldn't record it, you'll do it a different week. All right? It's all good. We'll have enough to go over for 1 week at least. Now, everybody face to face next week. We are recording next week, right? Okay. So next week we're not meeting here. Okay, you're meeting on Zoom. All right, everybody's on Zoom because we're going to record on Zoom. All right, and I'll be on Zoom too. So the 2 tapes we record, the recording dates, we're going to be on Zoom. All right, so run through the memorized part tonight with your partner, but the most important thing is for you to get to practice your skills so you can kind of see what that's like. And don't worry, it's going to take me a few minutes to make it to everybody, but I will drop in on everybody. Any questions before we start? All right, let's just give it a shot, see how it goes. I'm gonna make rooms. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Bum, bum. Oops. Let's see. I want to manage the rooms. Oops.
No,
Let's see. Return to main session. One. Okay, room 1, I need Rebecca and Emily. Miss Emily. Okay. Oh, okay.
Right.
Okay. And then we have Isaac. Layla. Okay, I'm getting there. We have Jessica, MH.
Yeah.
We have Lee and Jamie. And we have Emily, and here we go.
First thing. For your other, that I is mandating. And I would do the first one, everybody has some RC. There is. And the next thing is that being an alien, I decided to just report suspected abuse of children by the others or anything more than say, you population. That makes sense. Right. And I heard is that you're also a minor. But if you're doing a party, you're supposed to see your records. I would be required to release them. And I would also release that power saying that it's in relationship. And it becomes a part of your tank process. That's why I think it's important. It's important to have that. Yeah. And I think also your client. And then the last thing is if that however, we're gonna do that, however, I will only release what is really the best. Also, I'm not gonna give them and what other people will, yeah, your space. Given those suggestions are rare, but I did want to make sure that you said that or someone, I'm saying thinking. It could come from either side.
Okay. Oh, we're recording this one too.